Welcome everyone to this month's Ask Tom office hours regarding the Oracle Autonomous Health Framework. Before we get into introductions, I'd like to mention a few things. First, this is being recorded. However, all of you except the speakers are muted. And so if you have any questions, please type them in the chat and we'll get to them in the flow of the session. And please do so at any time, but you will be muted audio-wise. So please use the chat window. Secondly, even though this is a technical presentation and interactive, we will not be covering any issues that may be related to an SR that you might have. This is not an alternative to Oracle support services. So please deal with your questions on a non-specific nature with regards to any outstanding SRs. So with that in mind, I'd like to introduce our guest, Pawan Tare, who's a principal member of the technical staff on the cluster verification utility development team, which is part of our applied machine learning technologies. And in doing so, I want to make people aware, since we are talking to development here, that there may be something that is stated that is forward-facing, and that so please make sure you adhere to the safe harbor statement and not base any purchase decisions on what we are talking about here today. So to kick things off, I'd like to have Pawan actually give you a little bit of his background before we jump into any questions. Pawan, you want to jump in here?
Sure. Thanks, Mark, and hello, everyone. My name is Pawan Tare, and I've been with Oracle for 11 years. Majorly contributed to the development of cluster verification and cluster manageability areas and the products in the past 11 years with Oracle. My area of interest are verification and validation of environment, rather the systems, in order to install, upgrade, patch the Oracle softwares. I also take interest in diagnostics, diagnostics being diagnosing the failures of the software functionality, root cause analysis, and I also take great interest in automating the diagnostic tools by avoiding the redundant process of redundant steps of diagnostics with the help of machine learning techniques. So that's about me.
Okay, sounds good. So let's first off open it up for anybody's questions. As those who joined late, please note that you are muted and that your questions need to be typed into the chat. So if we have any questions at this time, please go ahead. But I'd like to kick off with a question I have, which is, what is Oracle's goal in developing the cluster verification utility?
The Oracle Clusterware stack, or the Oracle Clusterware software or database rack, is a complex piece of software. It works with operating system resources, network, storage, and hence it invites a lot of prerequisites in these components to be satisfied in order to successfully install, upgrade, or patch the Oracle softwares on the multi-node cluster environment, right? So the Oracle cluster verification utility was basically a cluster verification utility is popularly known as CVU, was introduced as part of release 10.2, and the main intention of developing this tool was to ensure that when user goes through the installation of this complex software product, it satisfies, to help the user identify whether the environment in which they plan to install or upgrade the Oracle Clusterware satisfies the prerequisites of OS, network, storages, in order to have the successful installation upgrade. So the main intention is to prepare a catalog. The main intention was in the past was to prepare a catalog of verification prerequisites to ensure that before we enter the installation or upgrade, we have the basic mandatory requirement of the software satisfied, so that the chances of having a successful installation or upgrade are very high.
I see. So you mentioned configuration checks for upgrades, etc. What other types of checks does CView perform, or what are the natures of those checks?
So if you are asking in order like related to the upgrade, then it ensures that the existing software installation is ready for upgrade. It has the latest patch level. It has the required resources up and running. It has the storage and network as applicable for the targeted version. So generally, the upgrade checks are intended towards the targeted version of the software. So if you are moving from release X to Y, the upgrade checks will have a catalog of prerequisites fine-tuned or to cater the requirement of release Y. So we ensure that the minimum operating system kernel version, the OS release, the operating system resources are configured, the user group memberships, the network configuration is as per the targeted software release which we plan to upgrade to. So that's generally the idea of having upgrade checks.
So, but however, you also run in daemon mode, right? So what type of checks actually run there while the stack is actually already installed and running?
So the idea of having the CView daemon or CView resource is to ensure that we proactively track the changes to the system, or to identify any changes which are incorrect and may cause a potential failure in the functionality of the Clusterware stack, and identify those changes and basically alert the user about the deviations or the incorrect system changes, so that the user can take the corrective actions in time, so that there is no downtime involved. So we try to avoid the downtime and avoid the failures in the functionality by proactively checking the health check and recommendations and the mandatory checks as part of the CView resource, which runs as part of the Clusterware stack.
I see. So you talk about the Clusterware stack. So which Oracle stack components does CView actually check?
CView checks pretty much all the important Clusterware stack components such as CRS, CSS, OCR, voting disk, GNS, GPNP, ASM, to name few. And it checks the integrity of all these components to ensure that they are functioning as per the expectations. And if there are any incorrect settings in those components, or if there is any noted incorrect behavior, then CView tries to identify and alert the user about the same.
So is this a continuous check, or do you run periodically? How often does CView run these checks?
So the CView resource is Clusterware resource, and by default it is run every 6 hourly. But the interval can be fine-tuned. I mean, basically what I'm trying to say is the interval is modifiable. Default interval is 6 hours, so every day you will have 4 times check being done in the environment. And CView resource run from one of the Clusterware nodes. So one of the nodes will perform the checks for whole cluster every 6 hourly by default. And you can fine tune it to as good as like an hour run. So every hourly it will check the environment if you configure it to, or configure the interval to be more often than the default interval of 4 times a day, which is 6 hours.
I see. So is CView enabled by default? Do I have to configure it?
Yeah, that's a good question actually. So CView is a CRS resource, and it is by default enabled. And basically, you don't have to do anything to enable it as such. It starts as part of the Clusterware stack, and whenever the stack you bring up the stack, the CV resource comes as part of the CRS stack, and it basically goes down as part of the CRS stack, so, or explicitly if you stop it.
Okay, so to get these 6-hour collections, they're enabled by default. Is that correct?
That is right.
Yeah, I see. So how do you mentioned that I can control how often these collections occur. How do I do that?
So what I meant is the interval the collection happens is generally controllable, and you can use the srvctl command. As I said, the CV resource is yet another Clusterware resource, so it can be treated as yet another Clusterware resource by the help of srvctl command. But the collections, for example, are always retained by default for a week. So if you have, say, the default configuration, you'll have a snapshot of your system taken every 6 hourly. So we are looking at 4 collections every day. And so if you say 7 days a week gives it to be 28 collections every week. And that's how it is collected. But as we see, like there are 28 collections kept in the Oracle base, or rather recorded in the Oracle base. But we make sure that those collections are in a zip format, so they don't occupy too much of the disk space. But if suppose you make it like, if you make it an hourly collection, you'll have 24 collections a day and multiplied by 7, so you have a large number of zip files created in your Oracle base. So, but by default, the collections are retained for 7 days, last 7 days.
I see. So I use servctl config cview or poofy command.
So servctl config cview would display the configuration of cview. Servctl modify cview will give you an opportunity to modify the interval or the destination location where you want to have the bits copied when it is run.
I see. Okay, that sounds sense. You mentioned this concept of health checks. Are these health checks enabled by default, or is there something I have to do for those?
All the health checks are enabled by default. So the idea of CV resource is to ensure that the operating system configuration along with the network and storage configuration is checked every 6 hourly. Additionally, we do have mandatory checks along with the best practices and recommendation, database parameter checks, for example, for each database is found in the environment. So all these form a health check catalog. So it's a comprehensive list of checks which is done when the CV resource perform the verifications every 6 hourly. And all are enabled by default.
I see. Oh, okay. All right. So, by the way, we've had some new people join us. Please note that you are muted and that we are taking questions in the chat. So please type your questions at any time in the chat and we'll be happy to answer them. So I do have some seated questions here. And so one question that comes up a lot of times is you mentioned that CView is involved in patching and upgrade work, but with regards to when it's running as a daemon, i.e. doing this automatic checking, and obviously if I'm in the middle of patching or upgrade, is this something that I need to actively disable, or will it do so automatically? How does this work when I'm actually doing a patch or an upgrade?
Okay, this is an interesting and very nice question actually, but as I said, CView resource is a part of Clusterware resources. So ideally, you do not have to do anything. It's a part of the process. So when we are patching or upgrading, when we bring up the stack, the CV resource will come up from the upgraded home or patched home, or so. And when we bring down the stack, CV resource goes down as part of the CRS stack. So it's a part of the process. You don't have to explicitly do anything or any explicit action for it.
Okay, so the actual installer process or upgrade process will manage the daemon for me.
Correct.
So that I don't get errors that are unintended.
Right.
Okay, so you mentioned, excuse me, you mentioned that CView actually looks for configuration issues or deviations from my baseline deployment. Is there any way I can get notifications when such a change is detected?
Okay, so this is very important to understand that CView resource has two ways of alerting the user. One thing is whenever there is a deviation in the system or change in the system which is incorrect and is going to cause a functional failure or is potentially inviting a downtime, we alert the user in the CRS alert logs, and every 6 hours you will notice when the CView resource runs. And if there is a change in the system which may potentially invite functional behavior change in the CRS functionality, you'll see an alert in the CRS alert log, basically alerting the user about the change so that the user can take a corrective action. At the same time, there may be some changes in the system which may not directly relate to the functional failure. But at the same time, a user would like to identify, oh, what happened? My system was up and running fine when I installed and upgraded. But after a week or so, I see that my system's performance has downgraded, or I'm observing some intermittent failures. So in such cases, the CView command line actually can be used to look at the deviations. So there is something called baselining. So when we collect, we actually baseline the snapshot of the environment. So when, say, for example, you install the cluster and everything is up and running, at the same time, CView would record the snapshot of the environment of all the possible configuration settings and record it in the Oracle base and zip it. So say, for example, after a week, you have a failure or some intermittent failure or a performance issue, and you might want to check what has changed, and you don't notice anything in the CRS alert log as such. So what you can do is you can take immediate snapshot of the environment and compare with the one which you took a week back, and it will basically show you the HTML page with settings which are changed. Like you will see the deviations highlighted so that you can identify what has changed in the system and whether that has caused any potential or whether that has played a role in this functional failure or performance of the system.
I see. So if I, in the course of normal deployment, I say add a database or add a new database home, does CView automatically adjust the baseline for the introduction of those new resources or homes?
Yes, actually, that's a very good question, Umar. So, for example, we started the rack with say 2 database instances and Clusterware home, and for say we would have recorded the baseline for those 2 database instances along with the Clusterware home. But going in future, say after a week or 2, we added few more databases, and what happens is when we take the snapshot, we consider the current setting of the environment, and we would record everything about the current setting of the environment. And when we basically ask for the deviation report would show that okay, there has been some changes in the system, but at the same time there are new databases added, so those database homes will be recorded as part of the report. But those will not necessarily qualify to be a deviation because you have additional databases added, right?
Okay, so but you are starting to monitor their existence and their configuration.
You're right. Yes.
So I don't need to do anything explicit to enable that monitoring.
Right. It works basically like a snapshotting the environment. So basically we attempt to snapshot the environment when the CV resource is triggered. So CV resource would basically every 6 hours when it triggers, it will take the snapshot of the current environment and record it and keep it in the baseline report. So you may have added databases or databases dropped, and it's any such changes will be recorded, but those are not necessarily deviations. At the same time, you will notice deviations between the comparison of the same two snapshots when we have, say for example, the OS configurations has changed between the two snapshots. It would mark those or highlight those to indicate the user that this has changed.
I see. Okay, so how do I know that actually the CView utility is actually enabled and working?
So as any resource, as for any CView, any CRS resource, we can use srvctl config CView to see what is the current status of CView, whether it is enabled, and what is the duration it is tuned to run, like the interval at which it is tuned to run. At the same time, we can use crctl stat resources -p -v -t command to report the ORAchk CView resources current configuration.
Okay, and so I end up having a daemon running on each node of my cluster, but only one daemon does the collection at a time?
Yes.
Correct?
Right.
Okay. All right. Is that collection done on a particular node, like the CRS master node, or is that just how do I know which node is supposed to be doing the collection, or do I care?
Sorry, config CView, self-cycle config CView would show the current node which is running CView resource. And as I said, if there is a failure, for example, it may be a master node to begin with, and so basically CView resource run on one of the nodes, and if that node fails, the CRS would fail over the CView resource to another cluster node. So the idea is CRS would make sure the high availability of CView resource when there is a failure in the node on which it is tuned to, it is configured to run, and if that node fails, the resource will fail over to another node and will start collecting the baseline or snapshot on that node. So yeah, the failover happens on the another cluster node.
Okay, so you mentioned that CView is managing, Clusterware is managing CView's operation. So we see Clusterware has this concept of a node resource, i.e. a resource that runs on every node, and a cluster resource, which is a resource that runs on one node at a time in a cluster. So how is CView set up?
So yeah, this is actually more in detail. So yeah, CView is set up to be a cluster resource. So it's not a node resource. And the Clusterware manages, not necessarily manages, but make sure that the failover of a CView resource happens to the healthy node when the node on which it is running goes down. Mm-hmm. So that is one thing which is managed by Clusterware to ensure that CView resource, being a cluster resource, is run on one of the cluster nodes all the time.
Right.
Does that answer?
Okay. Yeah. So how expensive is it to run that resource in say CPU or memory or?
So generally it's a very lightweight resource if you look at it, but when it actually triggers the checks, you may see a little bit of CPU usage or network resource usage, for example, because it runs from one of the cluster nodes and does the validation across all the Clusterware nodes. You will see a lot of SSH commands happening during the actual check happens every 6 hourly, right? So you'll notice that because we have to get the information from multiple cluster nodes about their current configuration. So we will notice the SSH command happening underneath, and there would be a good use of CPU in that duration, but that's a short duration. I would say a few minutes. Based on the size of your cluster, if you have like 10 or 20 node cluster, it might be a little more. But generally, it's a very lightweight usage of CPU in that duration. Generally, yeah. Otherwise, when the checks are not being performed, it's a very lightweight resource.
Okay, so what by explaining that it's using SSH, so instead of actually having it invoking the CView on each node, it actually reaches out and does a remote check on each node itself, right?
Exactly. Yeah, you got it right.
I see. Okay. So is there anything you mentioned about I can change the interval? So are there any other dimensions of CView's resource that I can actually configure?
So as I said, there are two things generally you can modify with CView resource, one being the interval and another being the destination location where you want to actually have the bits. So it's like you can use the srvctl subctl command with modify option, and you say srvctl modify CView, and dash help will list two options. One is the change the interval. So you can specify the interval in minutes. Basically, so you can say that run the CV resource every 60 minutes, something instead of 360 minutes, which we generally default configure it with. Additionally, sometimes user may have a chosen destination location. So as I said, that CView needs to communicate with other nodes. So it has to copy its bits on the remote nodes, like all the remote nodes at a particular location. Generally, it's a temp area, and that can be changed by user saying that don't use my temp, but use /var/temp for CView operations, or use some location which they do not, which they prefer to use for copying the bits or doing the remote operations. So those two things, like one is interval and another is the destination location, are the two tunable or modifiable parameters of CV resource.
Okay, so by destination location, are you meaning are you meaning just the scratch area, or are you also meaning where my reports will eventually land?
Oh, no, you got the right. No, you got the right word, Mark. Scratch area is the correct word I was supposed to use, I would say. So yeah, scratch area is where basically we would copy our bits. It's a temporary area where you would copy your bits, execute, and come back. Report location is always Oracle-based CRS data at global CView and the CView resource directory, which would have a baseline directory under it, which would record all the baselines collected for the past 1 week duration in the zip form.
I see. So you mentioned about this 1 week duration. Is that a fixed time, or is that something I also can adjust?
No, the 1 week duration is a fixed time. As of now, it's been a 1 week duration all along, and
okay.
Only that interval can be changed.
I see. Okay. So you mentioned that CView has been around for a while. Which versions of Oracle Grid Infrastructure have CView functionality?
It was introduced as part of 10.2, and the resource was introduced as part of 11.2.02. So the CV resource was first introduced in release 11.2.02, and it has been around since then. And CView comes as a default software or component as part of the Clusterware software.
Okay, so what you're telling me is prior to 11.2, I only was able to use interactive mode. But starting in 11.2, I actually had the daemon functionality. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, right.
Okay. All right. So obviously it's been evolving over a number of years here. What functionality? What are some of the major functionality changes for the daemon capability that have been introduced? And does any of these changes impact the versions of the database that I'm actually using in the cluster?
Okay, so as I said, like when it was introduced in 10.2, it was basically an interactive mode, as you noted, and it was basically a suite of APIs and command line, which was the intention of it was basically to make sure that the environment meets the prerequisites. With release 11.2.02, we introduced this resource, which actually initially started recording the snapshot of the environment for the Clusterware home along with the database homes. And to answer your question about whether it changes with the version of the database I'm using, yes, it actually would record the snapshot or of the configuration particularly to that version of database. So it would identify the version of database and accordingly fine-tune the catalog of checks it does for that particular database home.
I see. So you have different. So the scope of checks are different based upon the version of the database.
You're right.
Okay, I see. So speaking about those differences, how has the CView functionality changed since 11.2?
So we have.
What are some major innovations?
Yeah, so we have introduced various features. To begin with, we started doing the fix-ups. Basically, we have introduced an option called fix-up, which will automatically correct your environment for incorrect configuration. So when we detect an incorrect configuration, we would alert the user in the CRS alert logs, and the user can opt to automatically fix the settings across the nodes where they were identified to be incorrect. Additionally, we have done a lot of performance-related changes. We have started zipping our reports so that we don't occupy too much space on the disk. We introduced diagnosability as one of the features where a user, if observes a performance degradation or a failure in the environment, can use CView to diagnose the environment to identify what has gone wrong. So there have been notable changes or other features introduced since 11.2.
Mm-hmm. I see. So these reports that CView generates, are they used also? Are they collected for Oracle support services when I have an SR?
So by default or automatically, we do not upload any CView information from user's environment. But TFA, for example, can collect all the CView collection and upload if support opts or the user opts to upload it. So it's basically up to the user when they want to upload the CView collection or CView reports to the SR. At the same time, TFA would default collect these reports from the Oracle base.
So if I do a TFA CTL diag collect, all my week's worth of CView reports will be included in that archive?
Right.
I see. Okay. You mentioned this new diagnostic capability that was introduced. How does it work?
So this is interesting. Actually, we've been observing or we've been collecting users' feedback about having problems in starting their CRS stack when they brought it down for, say, for example, they brought it down for upgrade, or they brought it down for some downtime, or they brought it down for patching. And when they tried to bring the stack up, they would note that the stack startup fails. So that is where we actually introduced this new capability or a new feature in release 19.3, where as part of the CRS-CTL start CRS, CView gets triggered. If there is a failure in CRS-CTL start CRS, CRS-CTL would trigger CView to diagnose the environment, and it would focus on identifying the issues, say, for example, pertaining to the permissions and ownership of binaries, libraries, permissions and ownership of operating system directories, which really play a vital role in CRS-CTL, CRS startup. Additionally, the Oracle-based directories and their ownership and permission. So all these things are checked as part of the diagnostics performed during the CRS-CTL start CRS, but it is only triggered when there is a failure in starting the CRS stack.
So are you saying that the agent ends up calling CView when it detects if the CRS agent, or is CView notified to do this analysis?
So the CRS-CTL startup process actually would see if there is a failure in starting the stack, And if it observes there is a failure in starting the stack, it would trigger the CVU framework underneath. And the CVS framework would basically be given a scheduled time, like a pre-agreed time of like you can have maybe a minute's time to investigate this environment and bring a diagnostics report to, so that if we find any issues in the environment which may potentially cause the failure in the CRS start, we would basically display it as part of that command line. So CRS start CRS command line would have a message for user that failed to start CRS, detecting or diagnosing the environment for potential reasons for failure. And then underneath you will see the messages with particular error IDs if we find some issues in an environment, so that the user can actually focus on those and try to correct those in order to make an attempt again to start the CRS stack.
I see. So you mentioned about starting problems for CRS. Does CRS diagnostics do any other problem detection, or is it starting, and does it also deal with shutdowns of the CRS stack as an example?
No, it does not deal with shutdown of CRS stack as of now. We are exploring that. Additionally, the 19.3 diagnostics capability is limited to the file and directory ownership permissions, the bits to be set like sticky bit or SUID set on the, or SGID set on the files and directories we look for. It's limited to the file permission and ownership for 19.3, and we are exploring more.
So it's basically configuration information that might have changed, causing the stack to not be able to start up.
You're right.
Okay, but if I have a hang as an example for shutdown, CView, outside of just reviewing the reports myself, CView doesn't give me any additional assistance as at this point in time.
Right, you're right. So we are exploring that, but yeah, as of now, it is only limited to the start of the CRS stack, and it has a limited area to cover.
All right. By the way, those of you who are attending the conference, please feel free to type in any questions at any time in the chat, and it can be a follow-up to one of the questions we've discussed, or it can be just something that you're interested in with regards to CView. So please use the chat if you have such questions. So moving on, there is another check utility out there that's also been around for a long time, and that's ORAchk. So how does CView compare with what ORAchk does? Both
CView and ORAchk has its own purpose to serve. ORAchk, for example, focuses more on the best practices and recommendation of the environment. So it looks at the configurations and settings, which are generally best practices or recommendations. And CView mainly focuses on the prerequisites, which are the mandatory requirements of the CRS stack or database homes. And it focuses mainly on those. In addition to that, it would cover as many best practices and recommendations which ORAchk does as part of its CView resource checks. And CView runs as part of the Clusterware home, and it's a Clusterware resource, so it's by default configured to do these checks every 6 hourly.
I see. So do you and the ORAchk team get together to make sure you both are saying the same things if you overlap?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Mark. Actually, yes, we do. And we often meet and discuss about the verification and validations we do. And we make sure that we are on the same page when we report the deviations in the system, so that the user gets the clear picture of what's changed.
I see. So should I actually use both?
Yeah, I would say yes, you should use both in general. And CV resource is anyways by default CRS resource. and it would do its job of identifying, and it basically does the proactive alerting in the CRS alert logs. So the user is always kept posted on changes in the system, and it's a continuous learning process. So there may be some issues where we find them to be new, and we try to cover them with each release, and accordingly. So I think the best thing to do is use both. So ORAchk keeps track of the best practices and recommendations, and CView makes sure that it keeps track of the requirement, the prerequisites requirement of the software on the environment.
You bring up an interesting distinction here, that when CView finds a deviation or an issue, it actually logs it into the Clusterware alert log, versus ORAchk that does not access for writing the alert log. Is that not correct?
That is correct, actually. So yeah, as per my understanding, that is correct. CView would always write to CRS alert log. And also, one thing to notice is if CView observes some changes in the system which must be reported in the CRS alert log, like 10 hours back, it would not repeat the same alert again. It has already alerted the user about the changes in the system which are not correct, and it would not keep polluting the CRS alert log with the repetition of the failure or the error. It would basically intimate it to user once, and then will not repeat it until the user takes care of it. So basically, that's how it works.
So how do I? Okay, so what you're telling me is if I have not fixed the item, so in other words, I have a choice whether to fix the issue or not, right? And CView will not affirmatively tell me that I fixed the issue, correct? Or will that be included in the report, and it's just a case of it won't be alerted to?
Yeah, you got it right. Actually, it would be always included in the report. It will never skip that check. It will keep doing that check every 6 hourly anyways, and if there's a failure, it will be recorded. But at the same time, alerting into the CRS alert logs is done once.
Okay, so I will not get any clears from CView in the alert log of issues that I've fixed. I'll have to depend on the reports for that.
Right.
I see. Okay, so that's the sum of my seated questions. I want to open the phones once again to those who are in attendance. If there's anything, any burning questions that we haven't answered, please enter it in the chat at this time. Otherwise, we will wrap up the session. So far, I'm not seeing anything. And therefore, I want to thank you, Pawan, for attending us this month and giving us insight into cluster verification utility. I want to also note that next month, we will be having Barry Gleason back. We had him about a year ago talking about QoS management, but this time he's going to be talking about a new diagnostic tool that will be available on MOS later this month, which is called the Cluster Health Advisor Finding Explorer, which will basically be a way to evaluate Cluster Health Advisor diagnostics and its subsequent decisions and recommendations. So please tune in on June 25th for that session, which will be the next one in our series. As always, we are recording this and we'll upload this on YouTube. And so there is a Autonomous Health Framework YouTube channel associated with Ask Tom. So please subscribe. And these will be up there in about a week. It takes a bit of processing, but look for this session next week sometime. And please take a look at it and spread it around. I want to thank you again for attending, and see you next month.
Okay, thanks, Mark, for conducting this interesting session and having me over to talk about the work my team does. And thank you very much, everyone.
Good.
For joining us.
So long, Gabe. Yes.